So good afternoon. It's Friday afternoon here in Harpenden. So it's 4 o'clock, British summertime, and we are having some kind of summer. We are expected to have the hottest temperatures ever in the next few days. So we're enjoying summer, but we've got a brown oval instead of a green oval. It hasn't been quite this brown in the south of England since 1976, but we're enjoying the sunshine. This afternoon, I want to talk to you about a subject which, if I tell you the title, you might turn off because you think it's going to be boring. It is not going to be boring, I can assure you. I want to talk about a subject which I'm trying to think through what I really think. There's a little bit of the extrovert in me and a little bit of the introvert, but the extrovert side of me agrees with whoever said it. How do I know what I think until I hear myself talk? And you think, well, that sounds a bit shallow, but no, actually the process of putting our thoughts, especially if they're conceptual, into words is a great way to clarify our thinking. Sometimes as we're trying to put things into words, it doesn't quite hold together and make sense. And sometimes things fall into place and it's amazing. I can remember the first time I really had a significant sort of template through which to view my world. You know, we're always looking at our world through templates that we're often not even conscious of. For example, there's the cultural template. Cultural differences are remarkable in different parts of the world. I remember going to Afghanistan and just not being able to understand the people there at all because their culture was so far removed from my culture. So culture is a template that and the more we learn about more templates in cultural terms, the better. And I remember, I think probably in the mid-70s, a man named Dr. Glenn Martin came to teach at some of our schools, and he taught on presuppositionalism, and I'd never really thought about that before. I thought about, you know, when I have a difference of opinion with somebody, and when we actually get into arguments and all, and one of the things that I learned through him is that we start off most discussions with certain things we assume, presuppositions, and if we have different assumptions in a conversation, we're going to reach different conclusions, and sometimes we can argue and argue and never come to an agreement because we have not examined our underlying presuppositions. So his teaching was so helpful to me. But what I want to talk to you about today is another kind of template. But before I do, I want to remind you that we are putting up more videos than usual now because I went to the Sind. What a day that was in Oslo. And whilst there, I interviewed different people. And within the last 24 hours or so, we put up an interview with Suze Schmel from Bad Blankenburg in the eastern part of Germany. What an interesting story, you know, of God leading them in such a way. Well, I won't get into it. It's just go see it on the Facebook page. It's a really interesting interview. I would do a little bit of a story with her, what's happening in her life, and we would turn the videos off, and that was good, and then we keep chatting, and another really interesting story would come up, and we'd stop, video that. So you'll like those. But I'm going to talk to you today about two subjects which were also revelation to us, one quite a long time ago, and the other more recent, that provide us with a template which, when we think about it, helps us understand a lot of how our world should work and where things are not quite in the harmony that God designed for us. So one of those, one part of that template is the spheres, the social spheres, the spheres of society. And if you've been around YWAM very long, you know that there are 7 spheres that Lauren and Bill Bright, other people had it's kind of a revelation on in 1975. And, you know, that marked a watershed in the history of Protestant Christianity, especially of charismatic or Pentecostal Christianity, where we who had not been very engaged with all of society, we weren't very much kingdom people, we were rather focused in on the religious aspects. That time of revelation and those men of God going public on that subject marked a re-engagement with all spheres of society, all aspects of life together on this earth. So that was the spheres, 7 of them. Do you remember what they are? Think about it a little bit. They are family, religion, education, economics, government, media, and celebration. If you do them in that order, it makes an interesting acrostic, which is free GMC. I won't go into why that makes sense to me, but it's an easy mnemonic device. But the other aspect of this, spheres is one thing, but David Hamilton, I don't know how he came about this, because I've never talked in any detail how he developed this, but he then started talking about domains, or domains of authority. And he has reduced it down to 4 primary domains that God designed into human life. So that means not all spheres have authority. When you think about that, that's really true. Family, religion, education, economics, government, media, celebration, which ones have authority? And you find that there's a sort of inverse ratio where if one of the spheres has a lot of authority, it doesn't have a lot of influence. It doesn't get our hearts. It doesn't captivate our thinking. On the other hand, the ones that don't actually have any authority that they can impose on us often have so much influence that they in the end, it's like the tail that wags the dog. The influential spheres end up almost dictating direction to the ones with authority. And I think it's true that biblically, when we see the scriptures from the point of view of God's creative design, and we read right through scriptures, not just Genesis, you realize that there are 4 domains of authority that we all live under. But the way that authority is exercised from one governmental system to another, from one culture to another, from one economic environment to another, varies a lot. And I think there's a biblical right ratio of authority to influence, that when it's healthy, we feel free and we innovate and we are creative. And especially if we use our freedom to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbors ourselves, then we come into a time of harmony when humanity makes tremendous progress. But when we get out of balance out of tune with the exercise of authority, we chafe. But let me back up a little bit and think, which of the spheres has a domain of authority? And by authority, I mean the ability to an extent impose its will on us. So if we look at family, does family have authority? Well, yes and no. Yes and no. Does a parent have authority over children? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That authority, when exercised lovingly, just shapes healthy people in such a wonderful way. That authority, when exercised selfishly, unthinkingly, cruelly, distorts people in ways that, well, I was just having a conversation at lunch today, and our guest was speaking of another family, saying, yeah, they're still working through some things from their childhood. Now, we're talking about people in their 60s. And if you grew up in a family where you knew you were loved and that authority was exercised with your best interests at heart, and you knew that, even if you didn't like some of the decisions your parents made, you would have had the optimal opportunity to be healthy as a human being in terms of the family influence. But these days you read stories of parents who leave their children at home for 2 days alone because they're out partying. You read all kinds of abuses of parental authority. Parental authority is, I think, really difficult to exercise. Name the parent of teenagers who finds it easy. Because what we have to do as parental authority is go from a period in a child's life where you are dictatorial. You say, no, don't do that for their good. Or you must do that. I'm sorry, it is bedtime, and you have to turn off your phone, or you have to close the book. And the good parent, the effective parent, has learned how to make those kinds of choices for the small child, for the infant, for the toddler, for the preschool age. They've learned how to make wise decisions about what they're going to require and what not. Because one of the things about parental authority is that a parent has the responsibility for bringing another human being into adulthood, going from very little real authority for themselves into full authority for themselves over a period of years. And it's a hard ask. It's tough. And that's why in Scripture, the commandment about loving your father and your mother and honoring them is, as it says elsewhere in the Scripture, the first commandment with a promise that your days may be long. In other words, God himself has said, do this and it will go well with you. Dishonor them and it will go badly with you. Because the parental authority is so influential in our lives. So we honor them so they can love us. Sometimes it's a bit hard to love our children because they don't respect, they don't honor, and things have gone badly wrong. But at the beginning, it's really up to the parents to create that sense of respect and honor for them. I could go on for a long time because we've had lots of outstanding teaching about family and parental responsibility and loving one another as a husband and wife and setting that model example. But obviously there is real authority in family that diminishes as the child gets older, and eventually it's only an influence. I think that's a unique one of the spheres. And then when you think about religion, does it have authority? What do you think? I kind of wish that we could have a discussion here with a few people in the studio, but I just have to ask you the questions and make you think about it, or ask you to think about it. And my understanding is that religion actually does not have the authority in the sense of the ability to impose its will or its preferences on individuals. In fact, when we try to use authority that with consequences in religious matters, we call it cultish in our Western world today. But when you think about it, that temptation for religion to use coercive authority is the best word. In other words, to make you do something that you wouldn't want to do otherwise. When it uses coercive authority, it gets right out of control. And when you think about history, you think about how the institutional church, Orthodox, Catholic, go back into the Middle Ages, how they combined with governmental authority, and we'll come to government, because that's where the most deadly authority is, by design. But when government and religion have wed one another, and you have religious people in charge, as we did at the time of, say, the Crusades in the West, then you have a very oppressive system. Because when you think about Jesus and you think about the way God even dealt with Israel in the Old Testament, you find that God's government through the religious sphere is to woo us. It's to try to win our love, because we all know intuitively that if you can't make somebody love you, and if you did, it wouldn't be love. It's not meaningful. And God wants genuine love from us, which means that He gave us a tremendous amount of authority as individuals, and He appeals to us, and He woos us, and He pursues us, and He persuades us until we willingly give our lives over to Him. And that's the religious sphere has to keep operating that way. And if you're a missions leader or a local church leader, don't overcook the authority bit. We've done that before. I think we did it a bit in YWAM, but we did a lot of the free church, charismatic, Pentecostal churches in the 70s, 80s, where discipleship became a little bit too dictatorial, a bit too controlling, and people began to have real fear of leadership. That should never be the case. Never be the case. Because God wants our hearts given to Him by our free will, where we are persuaded that this is what we should do. And we love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, freely, without coercion. So the religious sphere should not be one with coercive authority. And when it is, it becomes super oppressive, as we see with, like I said, the Crusades, or the times when the Jews were driven out of Europe, the Inquisitions. And then today we have that happening in Islam. And it's important that we as Christians should not become self-righteous about this, because we've done it historically in the past too. But with the more radical forms of Islam, more fundamentalist forms, the government is run through the mosques. And what does it result in? It results in a regime after 10, 15 years, had a great honeymoon with the Ayatollah Khomeini coming back to Iran and all that. And before long, probably a decade or so, the people were realizing, hey, this is more oppressive than what we had before. Because at least before we had some authority in the mosques, kind of balancing out the Shah a little bit, but now it's all combined into one thing. And see, the separation of these authorities is really important, because when we feel free as individuals to innovate and to create a better future, then all of mankind moves forward. But when there are oppressive authorities who are obsessive about controlling everybody, think George Orwell's 1984, and of course many examples today in governments, then everybody just keeps their head down, and innovation stops, and progress stops, and you don't get people exercising their creativity, and you don't get the emergence of a middle class. That is, you don't get a large number of people becoming relatively prosperous. You end up with what happens whenever there is coercive authority that is religious or overwhelming by government, and you get a world where people just keep their heads down and they just want to survive. And those kinds of cultures and economies and all just go backwards. And there are plenty of examples in the world today. So that's a bit about the first two. And I can see that I'm probably going to have to talk about this some more in another session. What about education? Does it have its own authority? Well, I would put to you, no. So where does it belong? Who gives it its authority? Well, technically and historically, in most of our democratic systems, it's actually families, family authority. So it's parents who have responsibility through parent associations, maybe parent and teachers associations, and input into what the curriculum is and so on. But authority and responsibility have to go together. And if we take some of our responsibility and we slough it off onto government, which I think we've done quite a lot with education in our Western democratic nations, then government takes more and more authority. And government often doesn't, or rarely in the end, shares the same values that parents would have. So the system, the educational system, begins to operate out of governmental authority. And as I speak now, in this sort of season of time, there's almost a war going on between parents and government regarding education in the U.S. It's not so advanced here, but you get stories of parents who are incensed at what their children are being taught. They go to a parents' evening, they try to speak out and read bits of the curriculum and so on, and they are shut down and, so it is said, put on the list of potential domestic terrorists because of their anger at the school system. Well, I don't know how often that happens, but certainly it illustrates the battle for authority between parents who should have a responsibility and some say corporately, they have to have a system where people can be heard and you have to have, in the end, a majority rule of what children are taught, but parents should have a say. So education, I think, borrows its authority primarily from family, and I think family is responsible for educating children, and it's notable that home-educated children are growing in number in most Western nations rapidly. And our experience so often when you see young people, 18, 19 years old, coming into our training courses, when they're really stable, thoughtful young people, chances are high that they will be homeschooled. Interesting, huh? Well, what about economics? Does economics have its own authority? In a sense, yes. But it's authority given by individuals. So the whole area of economics really is the fourth sphere of authority, or mandate for authority, a domain of authority. And it's contractual. That is, when we get into economic things, we make agreements. We make contracts. When we are employed with an employer, we have some sort of contract. We are agreeing that we work so many hours and we get paid so much, and we can enter into that freely or not. That's how we thrive the most. Now, and when you get places and cultures and societies where there's no real choice about where you work where you're told, then we don't thrive as much. So that whole area of economics is one in which the authority of our economic activities is granted freely by individuals and families and so on, where we enter into economic arrangements by our own choice. At least that's the way we want it to be. Sometimes individuals or families will make such unwise choices or illegal choices that they end up having to come under the authority of the law, governmental authority, in order to stop what is essentially illegal activity. But as long as we're operating and keeping our word, the contractual area of economics works really well. Now, if we come to government, now that's where the most powerful coercive authority lies, and it should. It should. However, I really think that we thrive the best when government is the minimum we need. And here's a bit of a conundrum. the more we are governed by inner values of rightness, righteousness, the less government we need. But the more we have individuals in society who are not governed by right values, who don't have internal controls on themselves, who have abdicated their individual responsibility, the more that happens, then the more government we have to have. And we eventually end up with really oppressive government. I've reflected over the last several years, having lived in the US and grown up there until I was 21, and then having lived since then, so some over 50 years in Europe and primarily in the United Kingdom. I've lived in two different systems, and there's just no doubt about it that ungodly people corrupt any system, and godly people can make just about any system work. Godliness exalts a nation, but sin is a curse. What does it say in Proverbs? It's a blight on any people. But I've thought about it from the point of view of health and health care. There's quite a lot of debate back and forth across the Atlantic about how awful the US system is or how awful the UK system is based on people's loyalties. And our experience, I won't go into all that, but it's been mixed. But when it comes to the subject of domains, when we turn healthcare to the government, then we are giving it massive responsibility, and it will have to take massive authority. So it will have to tax the people. It will have to take authority over what treatment people can get and what they can't get. It will have to become a nanny state, telling us what we should eat and not eat and how we should live and not live, because it is responsible for raising the money and providing the system which looks after our health. And if you abuse your body, then at the moment, you don't have to pay a penalty for that. That is, they don't fine you more or they don't withhold treatment from you. But they do increasingly, as government here increasingly gets involved in telling us how we should eat, how we should live, how we should exercise, how much we should sleep, and so on. And it just, I understand it, and it's all pretty good advice, but it's drifting towards more coercive authority in lifestyle because we freely gave the responsibility for health care to government. The alternative to that in the US system of personal pay, via insurance or direct payment, is terrible too. It's okay if you're a prosperous person, you can afford health insurance. It works very well, it works really well. But not everybody can. So what do you do with the people who don't have the money for health care? And why don't they? It may well be that people are not thriving and don't have any sort of prosperity because they don't work, because they keep losing jobs, because they are lethargic and unreliable. There are all kinds of things that when we turn responsibility over to government, they then take more authority in our lives. At the moment, in most of the democratic regimes, everybody is collectively responsible for everybody else. And that's a nice thought. Well, it's more than a nice thought. It's a generous approach, but with the decline of personal integrity, the number of people who need more from the system than they can give into the system grows and grows and grows until the system breaks down, creaks to a halt. And whether it's a personal pay system or not, we don't know how to have effective government for people who are not self-governing according to clear ethical frameworks. And by that, I mean the biblical frameworks. As long as basic biblical Christian ideas were accepted by everybody in Western societies, they were governable. Not perfectly, but they were governable, and the systems worked. we're now moving towards a place where none of these systems are going to work well at all, because you just cannot care for people who don't take their individual responsibility and authority. So I've talked about a few of these issues, but let me summarize on, and then I'll finish. It's been about time. These 4 domains of authority. The individual one. And you see biblically how Jesus so respected, honored the individual authority. He never forced anybody to follow him. He often asked people to follow him who didn't. Or they had people who wanted to, he had people who wanted to follow him, but when they heard the conditions, then they opted out. But do you see the importance of the individual domain? As adults, we grow into a place where we really take maximal responsibility for ourselves and expect minimal responsibility from anybody else for our decisions in our life. And when we do that, we are a governable people. Then there's the family authority, which I talked about quite a bit, but it's that tricky authority which starts off being very directive and controlling so that the infant survives, and then goes through to a point where basically you get to a point where the teenager feels that they are an adult, but from the adult's point of view, they're not yet fully acting like it. And there's the tension of how much authority the parent can give over to the child and so on. Now, we've had some grandchildren living with us, and I'd like to happily report that our kids have done a pretty good job raising their kids, and when they come and live with us, we really don't have to exercise much authority at all. Just reminders to clean up your room and a few things, but very little authority, because they're that age, they're late teens and they've been raised well. It makes the point that good family backgrounds and good parenting leads to good citizens. Then there's the governmental authority, which is the coercive authority, and that's a God-designed thing. In a sinful world, you've got to have law, and law without consequences is not law; it's just advice. So a governmental authority has the right to and the expectation to impose consequences on those who do not obey the law, and that's the way it's got to be. And our best hope is that the governments we have and the legal systems we have will operate justly. That is, with equal opportunity, equal justice for everybody, regardless of their race or gender or background or wealth or influence or anything of the sort. Government, coercive control. And then there's the economic or the contractual, so business, science, innovation, all that works on a contractual basis where we enter into agreements that we keep. Oh, I've got so many stories I'd like to tell. Let me just say one thing, if you can bear another minute of this. I remember going to a man who ran a very large and very prosperous company. His wife had come to a deeper relationship with the Lord through some meetings that we did, and he wanted to get to know us. And we'd been praying a lot for the city of London. We're talking about the early 80s, and we felt like God was saying there's a battle going on, and it's about greed and unrighteous trade. And I shared that with him. He said, I really respect you, but you're wrong. He said, I've been doing business in this city for 50 years, and your word is your bond. And if you don't keep your word in this city, you can't do business. And he said, multi-million-pound contracts are settled with an agreement, a verbal agreement, and a handshake. That's the way it works. It's not about greed. It's not about unrighteous deals. About a year later, I was having lunch with him again, and he was just quite broken, because a man who presented himself as a Christian friend came onto his board, was invited onto his board, and ended up being an industrial spy who enabled a hostile takeover to take the company that this man had started, to take it away from him. And he became an employee. And he said, I am sorry to say, I'm heartbroken to say you were right. There's been a major change in this city. and it doesn't work like it used to work. So the city where people operate on a common ethical framework, a business environment, any economy that works on the basis, allows people to thrive. But as soon as you lose relationship, then you require more and more lawyers and longer contracts, and people are always maneuvering to try to get out of what the agreement was, apparently because there's a little loophole here that they can get out of. And it becomes less and less efficient, more and more of an anxious environment where you're always watching your back. So all this is a way of thinking about authority and the social spheres. And when we look at it that way, and we especially ask the question, are these spheres, are these domains of authority out of balance? And I would say at the moment, yeah. We've expected so much of government, that we've given them so much responsibility. They've taken so much authority, and they're taking more all the time. And our days of thriving to the maximum are probably behind us unless something changes. Let's pray that it does.